Hi everyone, this is Ali John Chaudhary, psychotherapist, and I'm here today with Fern Schumer Chapman, author. And we have a very exciting episode today because today we're going to be talking about parental favoritism and sibling estrangement. Now, it can be especially difficult when you notice and perceive that a parent tends to prefer your sibling over yourself rather than treat you equally. And this can lead to all sorts of adverse responses on our part, which can have a negative effect on how we see ourselves, both as children and as adults. So, in today's episode, we're going to be exploring parental favoritism and how it is that that can fuel us further towards sibling estrangement and what it is that we can do about it to perhaps potentially avoid that from happening. So, Fern, it's great to have you here.
Thanks, Sally John. Parental favoritism is actually one of the biggest risk factors for adult estrangement. And the reason for this particular episode today is that in January, the American Psychological Association published an article about a new study that included 19,000 people, and it determined that parents tend to favor children with certain characteristics. And so that's what we're going to talk about today.
That's wonderful. Yes. I think that's a really, really important topic for us, especially. And I'm glad that there's more research that's coming out now about this particular subject. And it's kind of interesting because I always ask myself in my own context, right, why my sister was hardly ever reprimanded. And I remember my mother actually saying that she was quiet and she would do what she was asked, right? Which I thought was very interesting as an answer and such, because it kind of highlights what the research said when it comes to personality traits rather, of agreeableness and conscientiousness. And the conclusions that I think the researcher was having with regards to the people that exhibit these traits and how easy they are to manage as people, as kids.
Right. The research showed that birth order, temperament, and gender play into a parent's preferences. And specifically, daughters who were conscientious, responsible, organized, agreeable, got much better treatment from their parents. And the parents were more likely to give older siblings greater autonomy because possibly they were more mature. But this has very big ramifications for the sibling relationship as well as self-esteem.
I absolutely agree. I think it's really, really important that we can highlight what this can potentially do because kids are not indifferent to this, right? Kids know very much when there's a sense of hierarchy that's starting to appear within the family, right? And I think that this is something that parents don't always necessarily aim for, but yet at the same time, kids end up feeling, right? And I think that it's Carl Pilmer that said that 2/3 to 3/4 of mothers actually have a child that is their favorite.
Right.
Right?
And the kids know who it is.
Very
There's,
much so.
the research shows, and I found this when I was writing Brothers, Sisters, Strangers, that kids are very attuned to preferential treatment at an extremely young age, like 2 or 3. But siblings who received less favored treatment tend to have poor mental health. They struggle to regulate their emotions, and their family relationships are much more strained and stressed.
Hmm. And that's not surprising when you consider that, right? Because when you're considered to be less than somebody else, or when you're often compared to somebody else, then what ends up happening is that you can end up having a sense of adverse thinking against one of your brothers or sisters because of that. And we've had some conversations about people, for example, being the inadvertent golden child, I think, in some families, right? And I know that in the Facebook group, it's been that way with some people where they didn't really feel that they should have had that label, and they were trying to break that. And unfortunately, what ends up happening is that this again creates further tension because when you compare children, say, to each other, really what you're doing is you're favoring rivalry. And unfortunately, in adult life, this transfers into more of a deterioration of relationships when you're compared to one another. So I think that that's really, really important that we can highlight this idea of being careful about comparing children, because parents, contrary to what they think, is it's not going to help people or children to shape up in any type of form. Rather, they're going to become reactive to that comparison with their brother or sister.
Or they're going to reinforce the label that you have slapped on them. So, favorite children tend to have better grades and healthier relationships and a greater ability to emotionally regulate. And those who are less favored are likely to have lower self-esteem, and they accept that label, and it follows them throughout life.
There's a danger that it can do that, right? And it's true, though, that once you have a lowered self-esteem, there's a danger that your choices may reflect that lowered self-esteem as well. And this is something that, yes, like you say, can carry on later in life, unbeknownst to kids that may be more susceptible to this type of prioritization or hierarchy or favoritism that we see in some families. So I think that it's really, really important for parents to be careful about that in particular, and highlight the strengths that kids have. I remember myself, for example, I was maybe a little bit more turbulent when I was a child, and maybe a little bit more outspoken and a little bit loud. And I would like to think that I've channeled that in healthy ways now, being an adult and being a psychotherapist, where I can, of course, help people and guide them, of course, in their process of living and such. So I think that there's healthy expressions that can come out of all this, provided that people are honored and cherished within their families and such.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I think those points are well taken. And sometimes children are too young to truly label because you can't see their gifts as early as you might. And so a child may not be good at something yet, but they may eventually come into their own in
Yeah.
a certain field. And so it's dangerous to slap that label really young. And, I'm often asked, what is the most important thing parents can do to avoid estrangement between their children? And I always say, don't favor one over the other. Don't label.
Hmm. It makes perfect sense when you think about it, right? And it's about making room for each other's personalities,
Mhm.
right? When you're bringing up favoritism, really what you're saying is that one personality is more important or more appreciated than the other.
Right. More
So
valued.
exactly. So we need to be careful about that, because one of the things that I find, especially that sparks estrangement, is the inability to make room for the other person's personality and such, right? Especially in some family dynamics where there are certain beliefs that are honored more than others, right? So, say in some families, for example, if say making money is very important and such, being affluent is very important, then there's a sense of the people that succeed and the people that don't within that very family. So if somebody has differing values about affluence and such, and perhaps may not ascribe as much importance to that, but yet is still true to their own beliefs, their own authenticity, their own inclinations artistically and such, for example, then that's key, because ultimately, if people don't, of course, allow themselves to experience that sense of authenticity, they can become enmeshed in a type of negative core belief that might be, for example, I'm not important. And I think that that's one of the dangers that can come with favoritism, is the conclusion somehow that you may think that you're somehow unimportant within that family structure.
And what you're describing, we've talked about in the past, and that is this idea of what is the family identity. If that family identity is about making money, then those who don't adhere to that or conform to that might be cast out.
Yeah. Yeah. So if we understand that, then ultimately it is about making room for people to be themselves. And there it shouldn't be that there's only certain traits that are recognized within the family. There can be differing narratives about what's important, right? And not to get locked into one particular aspect of how a family should define oneself. As a matter of fact, it's very important.
Well, or that the children are not there to fulfill your narcissistic impulses.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So I think that's really, really important and such. Because the danger I think that can happen sometimes is that if people stay locked up in certain labels and such, then what can happen ultimately is that it can create certain issues that can arise in unhealthy types of ways. And I'll give you one particular instance where I remember when I was living at home with my parents and my sister and I were there. I remember that there was a shelf that got broken, and I was approached by my father, and my dad was very adamant and that I shouldn't have done that. And I said to him, well, it wasn't me. I didn't break that shelf. And I explained to him exactly what had happened. And for him, it was almost inconceivable that my sister could have done such a thing. And it almost was as though he kept insisting that it was me. And the more I kept saying it's not, the more he kept thinking it was me. So I found that kind of interesting how it is that labels can sometimes define or try to determine conclusions about certain things happening within the family structure at home and such, if we're not careful.
Yeah. Well, that's a pretty interesting story. So I wanted to add that, yeah, that's a label that you were saddled with. But I've actually talked to a lot of women who struggle and feel like the family was fairly sexist, and that the boys, even though this says that girls are getting preferential treatment, um, many times women who were raised in the 50s, 60s, and 70s feel that the boys were favored, and this can play out in a very negative way, and they feel that their brothers got all the opportunity and attention while the girls were expected to fulfill gender role ideals of the 1950s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you can see the disparity, right, between genders and such,
Right.
and the type of expectations within the family, and how there can be internal pressures that can somehow push people into certain roles and such if they're not careful, right? And the degree of agreeableness can sometimes play into that if we're not careful, right? And that's why agreeableness can be good to some extent, right? It buys peace, but at the same time, it may not always necessarily allow for as much expression that's authentic when it comes to one's own needs and potential and such.
Well, and there are lots of ways to show attention. The study that we're talking about looked at how they interact with their children, how much money they spend on them, how much control they exert over them. And I think in a lot of cases that I'm referring to, the boys were getting the opportunity, for example, to go to college, whereas
Mhm.
the girls were not.
Yeah, exactly. So I think this is a really, really important point that you're making, because I think that we all generally desire a sense of order within our lives, right? And this idea that if somehow we get the feeling as though we don't measure up, it can really be invalidating and detrimental to our overall sense of belonging within the family. And, if anything, I think families should really foster the sense that you have your place and that you matter, right? It shouldn't be the opposite message.
Yeah. And that should be at front of mind for parents because each child is unique and has individual traits that are valuable. And our job as parents is to help that child recognize their gifts.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that those are great words for us to wrap things up for today, Fern. So Fern, let's discuss resources. What would be your number one resource at this time?
Well, I am doing coaching for individuals who are struggling with sibling estrangement, and a lot of these issues come up. And so I'm always welcoming new clients.
Great. And for me, of course, my number one resource at this time is the Sibling Estrangement Support Group on Zoom. That's something that I offer. I do offer some counseling sessions as well when it comes to sibling estrangement and other subjects, of course. And I think this is especially important for us to have some of these resources out there because of the fact that there's so few resources on sibling estrangement. It's so important to be able to offer that and offer a safe space where people can express themselves and find a sense of empowerment within themselves amidst people of like mind going through similar situations. So very, very happy to be able to offer this here, especially. And some viewers may, of course, appreciate the fact that I do also host an intensive workshop on managing self-esteem, which will be starting up in about 2 weeks on St. Patrick's Day this year on March 17th. So if some people would like to join me, of course, they can take a look at that on siblingestrangement.com/groups. You will see what it is in terms of description of each module and such, and hopefully you can join me then. All right, so Fern, it's great to have you here. Thank you so much for bringing this important and timely topic and this new research that's been coming out. So important for us to tie this into a lot of our experiences amidst sibling estrangement, and I very much look forward to speaking with you again on this and other subject matters.
That will be great.
All right, well, you take care and we'll talk soon.
Bye.
Thanks.